Welcome to today's podcast by Media News. My name is Desmond Fernandes. I'm a former senior lecturer in human geography at Montfort University, specialising in genocide studies, human rights issues and concerns relating to the criminalisation of communities. Today we have great pleasure in welcoming Margaret Owen to the programme. Margaret is the Director of Widows for Peace Through Democracy, WPD. WPD works to make sure that widows of all ages, irrespective of religion, class or nationality, are protected from discrimination and violence and can enjoy their full human rights. WPD prioritises widows in the world's most war-torn and poverty-stricken countries, helping widows' organisations in each country to fight for a better life for widows and their children. Now, Margaret is also a patron of Peace in Kurdistan, a UK barrister, and an international women's human rights activist. Today's podcast focuses on a controversial recent New York Times front page article that covered the human rights situation in Afrin, a city in northwest Syria. In a linked way, this podcast hopes to discuss human rights related issues in Afrin. Margaret Owen is being invited to share her perspectives on the matter. But before I do so, I would just like to present the backdrop to the New York Times article controversy. Afrin is a city in northwestern Syria, located in the Afrin district and part of the Aleppo Governorate. As a result of the Turkish Armed Forces military operation Olive Branch, the Syrian Democratic Forces withdrew from Afrin on the 17th of March 2018, almost 3 years to the day. Turkish armed forces and other military forces aligned to them, namely the Syrian National Army, captured Afrin the next day. Significant human rights abuses by the Turkish armed forces and its backed militias were reported to have taken place during the capture of the city, and there have been reports of substantive human rights abuses ever since in Afrin by a number of human rights organisations and the United Nations. As Media News recently reported, the United Nations Syrian Commission of Inquiry report confirms that the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army, the SNA, has been committing war crimes in Afrin and Serikaniye, including abductions, disappearances and gender-based sexual violence. Turkey is also held responsible. The 25-page UN report states that violations continue in the region, including arbitrary detention, enforced disappearances, torture and deaths in custody. The UN report explicitly states that since 2019, Kurdish women throughout the Afrin and Ras Al Ain, that's Serikaniye regions, have faced acts of intimidation by Syrian National Army brigade members, engendering a pervasive climate of fear, which in effect confines them to their homes. The quote from the UN report states that women and girls have also been detained by Syrian National Army fighters and subjected to rape and sexual violence, causing severe physical and psychological harm at the individual level, as well as at the community level. End quote. Deniz Arbet Nejbir from Mesopotamia Human Rights Watch has commented on the importance of the report to Yeni Ozga Politika. Arbet stated that for the first time since the Halabja massacre, it is openly stated that war crimes are committed against the Kurds. It is written in the report that Turkey is committing two types of war crimes in Afrin. First, through the Syrian National Army that is backed by Turkey, on the soils that are under the control of Turkey. The second one is more important. It is openly stated that Turkey itself is also committing war crimes there. Arbet added, many people are brought to Turkey from Afrin and tortured in Turkey's prisons. The report underlines this. It is very important. This might open the way to President Erdogan and the Minister of National Defense, Hulusi Akar, being charged for these crimes. The United Nations Syrian Commission of Inquiry report of September last year, we should note, explicitly additionally noted, and I quote from relevant passages here, that civilians residing in the Afrin and Ras Al Ain regions of Aleppo and Hasaka governorates have witnessed an onslaught of violations perpetrated by members of the Syrian National Army, as well as shelling and vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices. During the period under review, the Commission corroborated repeated patterns of systematic looting and property appropriation, as well as widespread arbitrary deprivation of liberty perpetrated by various Syrian National Army brigades in the Afrin and Razaline regions. After civilian property was looted, Syrian National Army fighters and their families occupied houses after civilians had fled, or ultimately coerced residents, primarily of Kurdish origin, to flee their homes through threats, extortion, murder, abduction, torture, and detention. The UN report continues, throughout the Afrin region, multiple accounts indicate that the property of Kurdish owners was looted and appropriated by Syrian National Army members in a coordinated manner. For example, in September 2019, civilians in the Sheikh El Hadid sub-district of the Afrin region described how members of Division 14, Brigade 142 of the Syrian National Army, had gone from door to door instructing Kurdish families with fewer than 3 members to vacate their houses to accommodate individuals arriving from outside of Afrin. The UN report added, and again I'm quoting from it, "Others have been forced by Syrian National Army members to pay a tax on agricultural harvests or a set amount of rent as a precondition for remaining in the homes they owned. Families recalled having been extorted." Also in Afrin, in December 2019, a senior member of another Syrian National Army brigade went from door to door in a large residential building, requesting proof of ownership only from the Kurdish inhabitants. As their properties were systematically looted and appropriated by Syrian National Army forces, civilians approached senior Syrian National Army members to lodge complaints. In response, many found themselves threatened, extorted, or detained by Syrian National Army members, whilst others were abducted and forced to pay ransom. The Commission remains concerned by the prevalent and recurrent use of hostage-taking by Syrian National Army forces, end quote. And again, it's really worth noting here the extreme situation of human rights violations that was reported by the UN. And again, I further quote from the report, "In detention, civilians, primarily of Kurdish origin, were beaten, tortured, denied food or water, and interrogated about their faith and ethnicity." Syrian National Army forces also held civilians in undisclosed detention sites. During the period under review, cases of sexual violence against women and men at one detention facility in Afrin were documented. The Commission also received reports of forced marriage and the abduction of Kurdish women in Afrin and Razaline, which primarily involved members of Division 24 of the Syrian National Army. Syrian National Army members also looted and destroyed religious and archaeological sites of profound significance in the Afrin region. In April 2020, several Yazidi shrines and graveyards were deliberately looted and partially destroyed across locations throughout the Afrin region, further challenging the precarious existence of the Yazidi community as a religious minority in Syrian National Army controlled regions, and impacting both the tangible and intangible aspects of their cultural heritage, including traditional practices and rites. And again, the UN Commission report concluded, "The Commission has reasonable grounds to believe that Syrian National Army fighters repeatedly perpetrated the war crime of pillage in both the Afrin and Razaline regions, and may also be responsible for the war crime of destroying or seizing the property of an adversary. The Commission also has reasonable grounds to believe that Syrian National Army members committed the war crimes of hostage-taking, cruel treatment and torture and rape, which may also amount to torture. Syrian National Army members also looted and destroyed cultural property in violation of international humanitarian law." The Commission notes the allegations that Turkish forces were aware of incidents of looting and appropriation of civilian property, and that they were present in detention facilities run by the Syrian National Army, where the ill treatment of detainees was rampant, including during interrogation sessions when torture took place. The Commission further notes that transfers of Syrians detained by the Syrian National Army to Turkish territory may amount to the war crime of unlawful deportation of protected persons, end quote. It's worth noting that there are multiple accounts of human rights abuses by respected investigative journalists and human rights organisations. The journalist Ibrahim also reported upon the following situation in Afrin in an opinion piece for Media News on the 18th of February, and I quote from his article, "Several reports and local investigative sources that follow up closely on the nature of violations taking place in Afrin confirm that the main goal of these armed terrorist groups and their supporters in Ankara is to instill fear and terror in the hearts of people through these war crimes and other hostile acts. The aim is to force residents to leave. Human rights violations include the kidnapping of women, the prohibition of the use of the Kurdish language, destroying historical sites and stealing their antiquities. This all began after the Turkish army and the Syrian groups aligned with it occupied Afrin in March 2018. It is regrettable that these war crimes continue, accompanied by a terrifying and alarming international silence, despite all that has been written and published, despite all the supportive documents and evidence such as videos, photos and audio recordings documenting the terrorism the Kurds in Afrin are being subjected to, and despite the cooperation of international human rights institutions in uncovering these crimes." End quote. Ibrahim Sheiko, the spokesperson of the human rights organization in Afrin, Syria, is also, we should note, on record as stating that after the Turkish state occupied Afrin in March 2018, it committed many crimes such as kidnapping, murder, torture, seizing property, and erasing Afrin's cultural identity through looting and destroying its antiquities. Turkey is seeking through these actions to reach the occupied territories and annex them to its lands through demographic change and Turkification of the region. Sheiko also appealed to local human rights and international humanitarian organizations to do their moral and humanitarian duty to stop these violations, put an end to them, and hold the perpetrators accountable. Despite all these types of readily available reports and findings, the New York Times on the 16th of February, in a front-page story by Carlotta Gall, sought to ignore such documented concerns. On the contrary, it stated that Turkey's President Erdogan, and I quote, has long called for the establishment of a no-fly zone or an internationally protected safe zone in northern Syria. As it stands, his forces have carved it out for themselves, end quote. Note here, and this is really the subject of the discussion during today's podcast, note here the suggestion that Erdogan's forces have carved out an internationally protected safe zone for themselves and the residents of Afrin. But as the other findings highlighted earlier indicate, it is hardly a safe zone for many. The thrust of the New York Times article continued in the same fashion to ignore the reported and extensive human rights violations taking place in Afrin and the extensive human rights violations perpetrated by the Turkish armed forces and its supporting military forces. Other quotes from the New York Times article include the following, for example, and I think it's important for us just to realise the extent of what the New York Times reported. A quote here: "Turkey has become the only international force on the ground protecting some 5 million displaced and vulnerable civilians. Today, the Turkish soldiers are all that stand between them and the potential slaughter at the hands of President Bashar al-Assad's forces and those of his Russian allies. Turkey has set up its own administration, trained and incorporated friendly Syrian militias into a military police force, and set up compliant local Syrian councils to run things. Our main aim is to make their life more normal," said Orhan Akturk, deputy governor of the adjoining Turkish province of Hatay, who is also responsible for Afrin. The Turkish police chief in Afrin said 99% of the attacks were the work of the PKK, that is the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the Kurdish separatist movement, and its affiliate in Syria, the YPG, that is the People's Protection Units, which is allied with American forces in combating the Islamic State. End quotes. Such one-sided reportage has not surprisingly led to significant criticisms of the New York Times article and outrage from a number of quarters. And I think I'll just go through some of these criticisms before Margaret can hopefully present her own perspectives. Seth J. Frantzman, writing in the Jerusalem Post of the 17th of February, pointed out that the New York Times has been accused of whitewashing Turkey's military occupation of Afrin and the ethnic cleansing of Kurdish people. Here are some of the points he raised concerning the New York Times article, and I quote, "When reporting in Afrin, it appeared to only give Turkish military occupation officials and pro-Ankara voices a place. An illegal military occupation. stolen olives shipped to the occupying power for resale, far-right settlers rampaging and attacking indigenous communities, religious persecution, locals kidnapped in extrajudicial raids, imprisoned in secret military detention centres, ethnic cleansing. All of this has happened in Afrin, in northwest Syria, an area that was once Kurdish and was invaded by and occupied by Turkey and Turkish-backed extremist militias in 2018. Since then, it has been ethnically cleansed of Kurds, and minority graveyards and religious sites have been ransacked and destroyed. The New York Times is now accused of whitewashing Turkey's occupation of Afrin. Frantzman continues, experts, activists, former residents and commentators expressed shock at the article online, noting that it failed to mention human rights abuses and the displaced people forced out of Afrin. Some compare the article to state-run Turkish media propaganda. The article was slammed for not including any critical or dissenting voices. The article hints at the fact that 160,000 Kurds were ethnically cleansed. Usually, when the indigenous population is expelled and other populations are moved in, it is called ethnic cleansing. In this case, Kurds were removed by Turkey and far-right religious extremist militias it controls, and Sunni Arabs and Turkmen were moved into Afrin. The removal of Kurds, as Frantzman notes, was not by mistake. Turkey had ample place to house Syrian refugees in areas it occupies in Idlib and Tel Abyad. Turkey has sought to change the demographics of Afrin, removing Kurds and Yazidis and other minorities. End quote. Now, Frantzman added the following criticisms to the New York Times article, and again a quote, it calls this, that is Afrin, a safe zone, similar to how the German Nazi regime referred to living space in areas it occupied in Eastern Europe, where it sent ethnic Germans and removed Jews and local Slavs. Megan Baudet, who closely follows Afrin, asked whether NATO governments get a free ethnic cleansing pass from the New York Times. The newspaper called this a de facto safe zone. However, human rights activists have described how for women, the area is no longer safe. Women are often kidnapped and held in secret prisons, subjected to abuses and extrajudicial killings. The Times is accused of a whitewash. It neglects to note that Turkey's occupation of Afrin is illegal under international law. It neglected to interview any dissenting voices, people displaced from Afrin, or any critics. It speaks to the police chief in Afrin who said 99% of the attacks were the work of the PKK, the Kurdish separatist movement. As Frantzman notes, this is an inaccurate statement since the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, is not separatist, and there is no evidence Kurds in Afrin wanted to separate from Syria. When it comes to Turkey and Afrin, it appears that no Kurds were allowed to have a voice. They were only pejoratively referred to as separatists, which they are not. They are the local people of Afrin. End quote. Now, Afhal on the 17th of February also reported that the untold story is that the overwhelming majority of indigenous Kurdish people were uprooted from their homes in Afrin, let alone the daily atrocities. Disgraceful, Azad Nebi, a former aid worker in Erbil, Iraq, and a freelance journalist, said of the report. A little shocked at how successfully Turkey has used the New York Times for a message to the Biden administration through this piece, said Yanis Kalpouzos, a visiting assistant professor in human rights at Boston University School of Law. It begins by swiftly and gingerly putting aside the Turkish invasion and the cleansing of Kurds, Kalpouzos said. Occupation is then presented as a force for good, not only like any NATO force, but also with soft power, he said. Turkey is a good actor. Kurdish resistance is a persistent terror. Yes, war is complex. Occupiers are not all bad, but this is embarrassing, he said. Now, having provided this backdrop to the New York Times controversy, I would like Margaret Owen to comment on the article and also comment on the situation in Afrin. Margaret?
Hello. I mean, the New York Times article is utterly shocking, and it's a mass of lies. It's as if it's been written by Erdogan's people. Because what is going on right now in Afrin, well, it's now 2 years after that awful Operation Olive Branch.
Yep.
it's going on right now, every day, because there's still something like 200,000 people, Kurds, still in Afrin. I mean, 100,000 people were ethnically cleansed and were suddenly had to leave their homes and are living in appalling conditions in Shabaa, in refugee and IDP camps. But there's still people in Afrin who dare not, the women dare not even leave their homes. But they're not even safe in their homes now, because these militias, I don't know all their names, but I think there are more than 50 different jihadist militia groups working with Turkey, under Turkey, to continue the torture, the abductions, the kidnaps, and the rapes. And you introduced me as the president of Widows for Peace Through Democracy, talking about widows, but we also are talking about half widows. And these are the women who don't know whether they're widows or not, because they're the wives of the people who've been abducted, the men who've been forcibly disappeared and abducted, and they don't know where they are. And every day in Afrin right now, these abductions are going on by all these different armed militias. And sometimes they're abducted and they're never seen again, or they're abducted for ransoms. And then their ransoms are paid and they're re-abducted. There is no rule of law. You know, once Afrin, at the very height of this bloody Syrian civil war, Afrin was a sort of oasis of security and safety. So many people, particularly the Kurds who were victims of the Assad regime, went to find safety in Afrin. And then we had Operation Olive Branch and the terrible, terrible occupation, invasion of Afrin. And it's unbelievable, because there's the UN report, there's the human rights report, and nothing is happening. And all the time, it's not just the abductions and the rape. You know, there were many Yazidi women, and they've been kept. I think there's a torture camp run by Hamzi, another, what's it called, Hamzi Bajadi, another horrible jihadist militia, which has kept Yazidi women torturing and raping and in sexual slavery for over 2 years in this camp. Apart from everything else, yes, Afrin has been ethnically cleansed, and through Turkey, it's now being populated by Arabs. Everything is going. The olive trees, that was their main economy for all those Kurdish families who lived in Afrin and the surrounding villages. But the olive trees have been cut down. Property has gone. And also they've abducted all the key people who they thought were affluent or upper class, like physicians and pharmacists. All these people have been disappeared. And what is absolutely terrible is that there's an international silence. And also, I was shocked just the other week to Google about Afrin and find some terrible news bit on something which obviously the public read, talking about how stable everything was in Afrin and how at last there was, stability and services, essential services, and everybody was very happy. On the contrary, in Afrin, there's absolutely no rule of law. There's no judicial system. There's nobody you can complain to, even when you are attacked or robbed or beaten or tortured or killed. It's going on right now.
So Margaret,
I'm not sure that people, the international community, in spite of that UN report, which is absolutely damning, and it's talking about war crimes being committed by Turkey, as well as by all those, 50 or so different jihadist groups, who also, in this unbelievable, unruly setting, also fight among themselves. I mean, it is the most violent place. Afrin, that used to be a place of refuge, tranquility, and safety, is now one of the most dangerous places in the world, particularly for women.
So Margaret, in a linked manner, why is the international community not acting to address these types of human rights concerns? I mean, are key governments not acting, as some commentators have suggested, because of special relationships they have with Turkey, and also because of some sort of hostile attitude they have with Rojava, the autonomous administration of northeast Syria? Or do you think there are other significant factors involved?
Well, let's start from the beginning.
Yeah.
I mean, always, and I have to talk because I'm a British citizen, a British
Yes.
UK lawyer. So I know a lot about why my country, why
Yes.
the UK refuses ever to condemn Turkey, and has for a long time, when they've ever spoken about the Kurds and the PKK, they've always talked about the Kurds as being troublemakers, or they've also always been pro-Turkey. For example, even in this country, we've never even acknowledged the Armenian genocide because of our relationship with Turkey. And we have never questioned the fact that the PKK should not be on the terror list. And all now, I mean, again and again, we try in this country to have them recognize Turkey's, not just in Syria, but the way Turkey is actually violating human rights against its own Kurdish citizens in Turkey. I mean, Turkey's got more lawyers, more political prisoners. It's got more journalists in prison than any other country in the world. Turkey, the prisons are, torture is actually rampant in Turkish prisons. So Turkey already, before even the Syrian war, Turkey was guilty of appalling human rights violations. What is it? Why is the EU so silent? Well, one thing is, of course, it's a blackmail on the refugees. I mean, they are all the Syrian refugees. Turkey has got a lot of money from the EU in order to keep the refugees in Turkey and not lift the plug and let them come into Europe. And that is a sort of blackmail. That's one reason that maybe that EU countries, apart from Belgium, at least Belgium is the only EU country I know of that actually said that that the PKK should not be on the terror list and refused to send back its Kurdish refugees back into Turkey. But the reason that this country, the UK, is desperate, particularly since Brexit, we are desperate to sell arms and to make trade deals. I mean, it's unbelievable. Along with the United States, the UK is one of the biggest arms suppliers to Turkey. And that is in violation of the ATT, of the Arms Treaty, where you do not sell arms to regimes that violate human rights. Well, Turkey is so much a friend of the present UK government that it doesn't even on the list of countries of concern. There are 30 countries of concern that the Foreign and Development Office have on their list. It includes Saudi Arabia and China and a whole lot of other countries, but not Turkey. And even in the Ministry of Defense, the kayak, where they have the list of 15 countries that you don't sell arms to because of their human rights regimes, Turkey is not on that. And then the whole thing is about Turkey's a member of NATO. It's a member of the Council of Europe. And therefore, it is absolutely in violation of the conditions of membership of NATO, which means compliance with the European Charter of Human Rights, why is Turkey not expelled from NATO? And I think one of the reasons about that is our fear about Russia. Although Turkey is already getting F-21s, it's already being armed by Russia. But the fear is that if Turkey was out of NATO, then it immediately that would give much more power to Russia in the region. I have to say, one is appalled and utterly disgusted with our own government's refusal and silence to condemn the appalling human rights violations that are going on both in Turkey and in Syria. But what about Azerbaijan? What about Libya? What about the Eastern Mediterranean? And also, for me, as a human rights lawyer focusing on women's rights, the way Turkey is targeting women and with the jihadist groups, it's there. It went into Syria under the wings of NATO, because under Article 5 of NATO, you must all support each other when you are being attacked. But Turkey was never attacked by Syria, and it went in not to fight ISIS, but to attack the Kurds. And all these mercenaries, all these armed jihadist mercenaries are working under Turkey. They are Turkey's agents doing all these appalling things, even attacking, outside of Afrin, they attacked the Yazidi refugee camp. They're attacking, and they're using, appalling chemical weapons and so on. But the way that they are attacking the women and raping the women, it's extraordinary. And we've just had, at the end of last year, we had 16 days action to stop violence against women. Nobody in the international community, nobody is actually looking at what Turkey, a member of NATO, a member of the United Nations, is doing. There are appalling stories about how they're torturing women, abducting women, forced marriages. It is absolutely terrible. Of course, it's created such terror now. And yet it is, of course, it's ethnic cleansing, because they've taken over all the properties and houses and land and everything to actually put in Afrin Arabs. And it was a Kurdish, mainly Kurdish town with all its villages, and so many of them have been expelled, living in the most sordid and appalling conditions as refugees and IDPs.
Yes, and I think that's a really important point to consider, that you've actually got hundreds of thousands of people living in desperate conditions, having been forced to flee after the assault on Afrin and other regions. Just in a related manner, it's evident that Turkey is trying to do everything it can to attack the autonomous administration of North and East Syria and delegitimize it. But do you think one of the reasons why the UK government and other governments have not acted again is because of some sort of hostile attitude towards the autonomous administration of North and East Syria? Do you think some commentators who've raised that point are raising a valid point, or
yes,
or not?
I'd like to talk about that.
Thank you.
For me, I have been 3 times in Rojava, that is the autonomous administration, Northeast Syria. I've been there 3 times, and it is a miracle there, in the middle of the most terrible, bloody conflict that's gone on since 2011. And in a region where generally the status of women is very low. In Rojava, under that administration, there has been an absolute miracle of women's liberation. And all this comes from the writings and philosophy of Abdullah Öcalan, who is the father of the Kurds. He's the leader of the Kurds. And he was kidnapped unlawfully. The Greek embassy in Nairobi got in 1999. What is that? Over 22 years ago.
22 years, yes.
And with the help of the CIA and Mossad, Israel, and the Greeks. And he was kidnapped. And he's been alone on the Isle of Imrali in solitary confinement, in torture, again in violation of international law, not only even allowed to see his lawyers or his family. But it's from his philosophy and writings that he said you can have no real democratic and free society unless you have women's empowerment and gender equality absolutely central, and you have women equal to men in decision making. And so in Rojava, and of course in southeast Turkey as well, always where the Kurds are, you have co-mayors, you have every decision-making body, even in the YPG, the People's Defense Units, and the YPJ, you have men and women co-chairs of the army, co-chairs in the government, co-chairs in the courts, co-chairs all the way down. It's also, in a sense, a utopian idea, because it's also secular, and it's not racist and not misogynist like Turkey is, because in this autonomous administration of Rojava, although the Kurds are more Kurds, it's also got it also has Turkoman, Assyrians, Arabs, all sorts of other people. It's also so it's an incredible model for all countries. It's not Marxist, Leninist, communist. It's about communalism. It's about the planet. It's also anti-capitalist and anti-nationalist. And I think that is seen as a great threat, the idea that you could actually have a society which is really about people from the very grassroots of society, all having a way of participating and making for a much freer society. And I mean, it should be a model for not just for all countries coming out of conflict. How do you get peace? How do you get stability? You get it through the equality of women. I mean, women are often more than half the population in every country, but in so many countries, they're treated like chattels. They have absolutely no freedom and no voice. So this is a wonderful, and I think it's such an incredible idea that I ask wherever I go internationally. I talk about Rojava as a model that we should all look at to adapt to our own societies, even here in the UK. But I think there's a real almost existentialist fear of this new way, a third way of looking at society. And, the regimes now, we have more and more, unfortunately, authoritarian regimes, which are often mostly right-wing, which also fuel populist right-wing groups. But for them, this is a sort of shock and anathema. So that's another reason why they don't want to support it. I'm quite sure that if we had a Labour government in this country, we would actually, I think we would actually make progress, and they would actually stop arms sales to countries like Turkey. But I am saying that any country, including the UK, that continues to sell arms to Turkey, and this country even gives military training to Turkey, and is silent and refuses to condemn, even in spite of that UN report, it makes us and other countries that sell arms even complicit in these war crimes. And I'm a very old woman now, but I remember the war, and I come from Jewish parents, and my father was a lawyer. And we remember very, very well how we appeased Hitler in the early 30s. But maybe in those days, people didn't know what was happening in the concentration camps. They didn't happen about Lebensraum and all this ethnic cleansing that was going on about the Holocaust. But these days we do know, because through social media, we've got all these, we can see, we know what's happening. So that makes our silence even more appalling, and makes the UK actually complicit and accessory in these terrible, terrible war crimes. And you know that all over the world now, maybe it's always been so, but now we know more and more in detail that rape is used as a weapon of war. It completely destroys families forever. It demoralizes people. It's the most terrible, terrible weapon of war. It's as terrible as cluster bombs or chemical weapons, because the impact of these rapes goes on and destroys families forever. And it also produces all these children who are born as a result of the rapes, whose futures are very, very unsure and problematic. I think it's so. You're asking me. Your question was,
Yes.
what is the reason? I think these reasons are fear of this extraordinary new idea of a third way, which, because it's new, or of course it has been tried in the past and it's failed, but it's terribly fragile because Rojava itself is being attacked by Turkey. Oh, I must turn off my.
That's fine.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
And I think it's very frightening, any great movement that actually attacks our present corrupt capitalist.
Yes.
Manages it. That is one of the problems. And as I
Yeah.
said before, the greed for trade. So what comes first now is trade deals and arms sales, and that comes long before any consideration of human rights.
Well, thank you very much, Margaret, for that. Yes, obviously, the issue you're raising there is the threat of a good example, which is obviously presented by Rojava. The crisis within capitalism, I think, and as you say, a lot of nation states following this very narrow attitude of arms sales and pushing through or ignoring all the really substantive issues you mentioned there, which I think, I said, looking at the whole gender rights issue, that's something which cuts at the heart of, critiques of, as you say, the UK or Western governments and states and everything like that. So it just seems incredible that this experiment, which is trying to promote all these incredible things, is sort of being strangled in many ways. And I think, as you say, with the silence and complicity of the international community, these horrors are being allowed to continue. I'd just like to say thank you very much for your contribution today. I hope we can actually invite you to talk further about these issues. But I think we just have to end the podcast today. But I said, I hope that's presented quite a fruitful basis for thought for people listening to this program. And I said, I hope to have you on again to discuss these issues.
Can I just say that I'm coming up right now to the 65th session of the UN Commission on the Status of Women. And we have a parallel event on widows speaking out. And we will be talking about this to the Commission on the Status of Women on March the 17th.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Margaret.